Good evening. Tonight's story is The Mysterious Tale of the Marriage of the Fox's Daughter by Songling Pu, translated by Herbert Alan Giles. These stories were collected in 17th century China, and this English translation was originally published in 1880. Giles's edition of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio gives copious footnotes that explain more about the customs and culture referenced in each story. After consideration, I have decided to omit them from this narration. They cover fairly ordinary observations that people are expected to bring presents to a wedding, that sometimes people drink too much on festive occasions, that Chinese people make colorful lanterns. I don't think they add anything substantial for the enjoyment of this story as a work of fiction. You are, as always, encouraged to visit the link in the description below to read the text for yourself for a bit more context. But now, let's open our imaginations and begin. A president of the Board of Civil Office named Yin, and a native of Licheng when a young man, was very badly off, but was endowed with considerable physical courage. Now, in this part of the country there was a large establishment covering several acres with an unbroken succession of pavilions and verandas and belonging to one of the old county families. But because ghosts and apparitions were frequently seen there, the place had for a long time remained untenanted and was overgrown with grass and weeds, no one venturing to enter in, even in broad daylight. One evening, when Yen was carousing with some fellow students, one of them jokingly said, "If anybody will pass a night in the haunted house, the rest of us will stand him a dinner." Mr. Yen jumped up at this and cried out, "What is there difficult in that?" So, taking with him a sleeping mat, he proceeded thither, escorted by all his companions as far as the door, where they laughed and said, "We'll wait here a little while. In case you see anything, shout out to us at once." "If there are any goblins or foxes," replied Yin, "I'll catch them for you." He then went in and found the paths obliterated by long grass which had sprung up, mingled with weeds of various kinds. It was just the time of the new moon, and by its feeble light he was able to make out the door of the house. Feeling his way, he walked on until he reached the back pavilion, and then went up onto the moon terrace, which was such a pleasant spot that he determined to stop there. Gazing westwards, he sat for a long time looking at the moon, a single thread of light embracing in its horns the peak of a hill without hearing anything at all unusual. So, laughing to himself at the nonsense people talked, he spread his mat upon the floor, put a stone under his head for a pillow, and lay down to sleep. He had watched the cowherd and the lady until they were just disappearing, and was on the point of dropping off, when suddenly he heard footsteps down below, coming up the stairs. Pretending to be asleep, he saw a servant enter, carrying in his hand a lotus-shaped lantern, who, on observing Mr. Yen, rushed back in a fright and said to someone behind, "There is a stranger here." The person spoken to asked who it was, but the servant did not know. And then up came an old gentleman who, after examining Mr. Yen closely, said, "It's the future president. He's as drunk as can be. We needn't mind him. Besides, he's a good fellow and won't give us any trouble." So they walked in and opened all the doors, and by there were a great many other people moving about, and quantities of lamps were lighted till the place was as light as day. About this time, Mr. Yen slightly changed his position and sneezed, upon which the old man, perceiving that he was awake, came forward and fell down on his knees, saying, "Sir, I have a daughter who is to be married this very night. It was not anticipated that your honor would be here. I pray, therefore, that we may be excused." Mr. Yin got up and raised the old man, regretting that, in his ignorance of the festive occasion, he had brought with him no present. "Ah, sir," replied the old man, "your very presence here will ward off all noxious influences, and that is quite enough for us." He then begged Mr. Yin to assist in doing the honors, and thus double the obligation already conferred. Mr. Yin readily assented and went inside to look at the gorgeous arrangements they had made. He was here met by a lady, apparently about 40 years of age, whom the gentleman introduced as his wife, and he had hardly made his bow when he heard the sound of flageolets, and someone came hurrying in, saying, "He has come!" The old gentleman flew out to meet this personage, and Mr. Yin also stood up, awaiting his arrival. In no long time, a bevy of people with gauze lanterns ushered in the bridegroom himself, who seemed to be about 17 or 18 years old and of a most refined and prepossessing appearance. The old gentleman bade him pay his respects first to their worthy guest, and upon his looking towards Mr. Yin, that gentleman came forward to welcome him on behalf of the host. Then followed ceremonies between the old man and his son-in-law, and when these were over, they all sat down to supper. Hosts of waiting maids brought in profuse quantities of wine and meats, with bowls and cups of jade or gold, till the table glittered again. And when the wine had gone round several times, the old gentleman told one of the maids to summon the bride. This she did, but some time passed and no bride came. So the old man rose and drew aside the curtain, pressing the young lady to come forth, whereupon a number of women escorted out the bride, whose ornaments went tinkle-tinkle as she walked along, sweet perfumes being all the time diffused around. Her father told her to make the proper salutation, after which she went and sat by her mother. Mr. Yin took a glance at her and saw that she wore on her head beautiful ornaments made of kingfisher's feathers, her beauty quite surpassing anything he had ever seen. All this time they had been drinking their wine out of golden goblets big enough to hold several pints, when it flashed across him that one of these goblets would be a capital thing to carry back to his companions in evidence of what he had seen. So he secreted it in his sleeve, and, pretending to be tipsy, leaned forward with his head upon the table, as if going to sleep. "The gentleman is drunk," said the guests, and by Mr. Yin heard the bridegroom take his leave, and there was a general trooping downstairs to the tune of a wedding march. When they were all gone, the old gentleman collected the goblets, one of which was missing, though they hunted high and low to find it. Someone mentioned the sleeping guest, but the old gentleman stopped him at once for fear Mr. Yin should hear, and before long silence reigned throughout. Mr. Yin then arose. It was dark, and he had no light, but he could detect the lingering smell of the food, and the place was filled with the fumes of wine. Faint streaks of light now appearing in the east, he began quietly to make a move, having first satisfied himself that the goblet was still in his sleeve. Arriving at the door, he found his friends already there, for they had been afraid that he might come out after they left and go in again early in the morning. When he produced the goblet, they were all lost in astonishment, and, on hearing his story, they were fain to believe it, well knowing that a poor student like Yin was not likely to have such a valuable piece of plate in his possession. Later on, Mr. Yin took his doctor's degree and was appointed magistrate over the district of Fei Chiu, where there was an old established family of the name of Chu. The head of the family asked him to a banquet in honor of his arrival, and ordered the servants to bring in the large goblets. After some delay, a slave girl came and whispered something to her master, which seemed to make him very angry. Then the goblets were brought in, and Mr. Yin was invited to drink. He now found that these goblets were precisely the same shape and pattern as the one he had at home, and at once begged his host to tell him where he had had these made. "Well," said Mr. Chu, "there should be 8 of them. An ancestor of mine had them made when he was a minister at the capital by an experienced artificer. They have been handed down in our family from generation to generation, and have now been carefully laid by for some time, but I thought we would have them out today as a compliment to your honor. However, there are only 7 to be found. None of the servants can have touched them, for the old seals of 10 years ago are still upon the box, unbroken. I don't know what to make of it." Mr. Yin laughed and said, "It must have flown away." Still, it is a pity to lose an heirloom of that kind, and as I have a very similar one at home, I shall take it upon myself to send it to you." When the banquet was over, Mr. Yin went home, and, taking out his own goblet, sent it off to Mr. Chu. The latter was somewhat surprised to find that it was identical with his own, and hurried away to thank the magistrate for his gift, asking him at the same time how it had come into his possession. Mr. Yin told him the whole story, which proves conclusively that although a fox may obtain possession of a thing, even at a distance of many hundred miles, he will not venture to keep it altogether. I find this mental image of deep night in a ruined villa and the magical wedding feast with the sounds of the music and the tinkling of the bride's ornaments such a compelling picture. This story is very beautiful and very subtle. I understand why the translator named it The Marriage of the Fox's Daughter, but I was actually tempted to call it something else, because the fact that the wedding party is comprised of foxes is sort of a twist that's given away at the end. We're supposed to understand that from seeing the horns of the moon embracing the hill, which isn't really possible, in the garden in the beginning, to the disappearance of a cup with the unbroken seals on the box, Mr. Yin was in a kind of magical alternate reality the whole time he was in the house. This English language title kind of spoils that. In China, as in other parts of East Asia, foxes aren't really animals. They are trickster spirits with magical powers. They typically appear disguised as a beautiful woman, but they can take on a range of forms. And a fox spirit might be a good omen or a bad omen. They appear in thousands of folk tales, and an old Chinese adage says that there can be no village where a fox spirit is not present. In this story, the foxes are absolutely lovely. They're incredibly gracious to Mr. Yin, and they treat him with care and respect. They have a beautiful wedding feast, and everyone is just generous and charming, which is especially funny to me because the whole setup of the story is of this spooky ghost story. Also, this story is at least 400 years old, and it still starts with the friends betting each other that nobody can spend the night in the spooky haunted house like story setup, which I think is hilarious. This is our second story from Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, written in the 1600s by Songling Pu and translated into English by Herbert Alan Giles in the 1800s. As mentioned before, Pu spent decades collecting weird old folk tales before publishing this iconic collection. It's impossible to tell how old these stories really are or where they originated. Many of these stories weren't translated into English at all because they were too racy for Victorian readers. Like the 1001 Nights, the actual collection of stories varies wildly between different versions and translations. If you listen all the way to the end of the video, you get to hear me make a little confession. This week's confession is that I am entirely preoccupied with the task of packing and moving. I currently live in a very tiny apartment, and I have crammed every corner of it with all my trinkets and whatnots over the past few years. Everything is kind of weirdly shaped and it's difficult to pack, and there's no space to stack boxes or sort things or get anything out of the way, and I'm trying to dismantle things while I'm still living here. It's very weird and disruptive. Also, I think of myself as a tidy person, but it is frankly embarrassing how much dust is on literally everything. Like the horrors in the nooks and crannies around here. So I am very much looking forward to setting up my new office and making a little recording space, but I'm also concerned about exactly how long that's going to take. Everything is all disrupted and dusty and unrestful, and I am very preoccupied with trying to get it all organized and transitioned smoothly. It is a little bit stressful and very exciting. This is Restored Lore, where I find weird, old, odd, and obscure stories, and I share them with you every week. If you are into overlooked literature from around the world, you should subscribe to the channel and choose notifications so you don't miss anything. Please also drop a like or a comment on this video if you enjoyed it, and I will see you next week.